Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anilesh Mahajan. I'm a journalist by profession. I'll be taking you through to this wonderful evening where we are having a special lecture from Alastair Newton. Mr. Newton worked as a diplomat in UK and worked in various capacities, and he also understands US politics and we requested him to join us and give us the perspective of the policies which we are expecting if Joe Biden wins U.S. presidential election. What would be his policies toward other economies, and especially towards India? Uh, in last 3 to 4 years of Donald Trump, we have seen disruptions happening, not only in the security aspect but also in the trade, the global trade. He First decision he took was to walk out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Barack Obama was positioning as one of the very big multilateral after WTO. Then we have also seen that Donald Trump walked out of the Paris commitments on the climate change. Um, these were big disruptions. 4 years down the line, we are already seeing a first of its kind trade war in the modern history between US and China, which is impacting the economies across the world. India is also no different. We are being impacted. It has opened up new avenues for Indian companies. It's not business as usual. Plus, Mr. Trump has also moved ahead and levied tariffs on, and he also has changed the treatment extended to China as well as India into the differential tariff mechanisms. So, it's a different world altogether. Then, if we see towards Democrats, there are plus and there are some apprehensions which we have. There is a positive that they are talking about a liberal H-1B visa policy. They are also talking about that the spouses of H-1 visa holders, they should be allowed to work. But on the strategic front, we are a bit apprehensive that how will the Democrat regime would treat India's stance on certain changes which we have made in our laws, like the abrogation of 370, which was giving a special status to our one party and the
अरे शुक्र है
amendment
ना रहते हैं लाइट लगा
amendments which we have made in our Citizens Act, where we have decided to accept, the people with the people who are facing a religious persecution in our neighborhood would be given citizenship. We have seen in last 1 year there are contradictory remarks coming from senior Democrat leaders. Uh, then we are also not clear on which way this trade war with US would go, trade war with China would go in, when if Joe Biden wins. So these are, many of the apprehensions which many of the Indians have in our mind. We also understand that if somebody is in opposition, he speaks a different language, and once he gets, a saddle under his control, he's a different human being altogether. We can understand this. With all these apprehensions and these questions in our mind, we invited Mr. Newton. We welcome him, Mr. Newton. We really appreciate that you have joined. He's right now in Zambia, from where he has joined us. We welcome you. We also have with us Dr. Shriram Sundar Chawalia. He's a dean of one of the very prestigious institutes, and he is writing and he's constantly commenting on India's foreign policy. He's author of Modi's foreign policy doctrine. Modi Doctrine, the book was called. And he was one of the very early academicians to pick up the trends of Modi's foreign policy. And he's closely following Indo-US relationship. I welcome Dr. Chawla as well. Welcome. I also welcome Dr. Ashwini Mahajan. He's national co-convener of Swadeshi Jagran Manch and a very eminent economist. So he'll be giving us his remarks at the end of the day. And we also welcome Rajiv Nayan ji. Dr. Rajiv Nayan is part of Ministry of Defense think tank IDSA and works closely on the international relations and India's relationship with various multilaterals. I welcome you all. There are very prestigious people who have joined our discussion today. I especially wanted to name Smita Purushottamji. She's former India's ambassador to Switzerland, Chile, and other parts of the world. We welcome Smitaji. We welcome Jyoti Kiranji. Jyotiji is good friend. Plus, above all, she's eminent economist, and she was chairperson of Finance Commission of Rajasthan, and she also works very closely on the Indo-US relationship. With all these things, sir, I invite Dr. Alastair Newton to begin his lecture. Sir, mic is yours, and all our ears are with you. I welcome you, and you can start your discussion. And just for a hygiene purpose, I just request everybody to mute their mics so that there is no disruption, and we can concentrate on whatever Mr. Newton has to tell us today. Mr. Newton, mic is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Annelies. It's a great pleasure to be on with you again, and with such eminent colleagues around the table as well. Let me start by saying this. I'm not actually sure what you've left me to say, given the breadth and depth of your introduction, but I'll see if I can add a bit of value from the perspective at which I've been looking at prospects of a Biden administration. Let me start by saying that this is still by no means a total given. Top psephologists at the moment are putting something like an 85 to 90% probability on a Biden victory. But we all know that strange things happen in opinion polling, strange things happen in elections. And in the case of the US and Donald Trump, we have to assume that strange things could happen after the election, and in particular to bear in mind that we are going to have by then, in all probability, a conservative dominated Supreme Court. And I hardly need remind the experts in the room and on the line that in the year 2000, the US election outcome was actually determined not by voters, but by the US Supreme Court. Nevertheless, for the purposes of this discussion, I am going to assume that Joe Biden does indeed become the next president of the United States of America on the 20th of January, 2021. And I'm also going to assume, in the interests of simplicity, a somewhat more risky forecast that he will enjoy a slim majority in the upper house of the US Congress, the Senate. I think it's pretty much a given that the Democrats will retain their majority in the lower house, the House of Representatives. So the context in which I'm going to talk is going to be essentially a Democratic Party clean sweep on the 3rd of November, although we are very unlikely to know the outcome of the presidential election for some days after that, given the amount of postal voting. Just to put that in context, something like 40 million Americans have already voted. So Joe Biden, an international relations expert more than he is a domestic policy expert, will no doubt be looking long and hard at American foreign policy. He's had a lot to say about this. You can find all sorts of interesting stuff on his campaign website, but perhaps even more interesting is to look at the people he has around him, because it is certainly the case, as Emma Ashford, an eminent commentator remarked in the New York Times back in August that personnel is policy. And if you look at the many advisors who Biden has on foreign affairs and international relations, it's not difficult to understand that Biden wishes to turn the clock back, as he sees it, to what he refers to as a normal US foreign policy, which is certainly not something we have enjoyed during the Trump era. Now, that all sounds very good and so on, but what Biden seems to mean by that is a reversion to what foreign policy experts call the Washington Consensus, which is not to be confused with the IMF's economic version of the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus in international relations terms is Pax Americana, the American model which began immediately after the Second World War and which served not only the West, but also much of the developing world pretty well for the period from then through until the start of this century. We could have an interesting discussion about how it has faded since then, but without going into detail, suffice it to say that we now live clearly in a multipolar world. The world has moved on enormously in the last 20 years and at very high speed, economically and geopolitically. And it's not at all clear that the model in which Joe Biden was brought up, and indeed many of those who are advising him, is actually very applicable today. So I think the first thing that a Biden administration is going to have to get to grips with is that its model will have to be fine-tuned to cope with the modern world. And there will therefore be a degree of uncertainty about where policy is going to come down in detail over time. So Biden will be a more dependable ally. He will have more consistent policy. Policy will not be determined by a presidential whim, which will then have to be turned into some sort of coherent statement by the State Department or the Department of Defense, or indeed the foreign policy via Twitter would be put to rest, at least for the next 4 years. So a more reliable, more dependable, more consistent foreign policy, and no doubt that will cause a sigh of relief to be breathed in capitals all around the world, not least, I would suggest, in New Delhi. Now, let's get specifically to India, having talked about the general foreign policy context. Back in as long ago as 2006, Joe Biden actually had a vision for India, in inverted commas. And he included in that the following statement: "My dream is that in 2020, the two closest nations in the world will be India and the United States." Now, there's probably a bit of hyperbole in that, to be honest, but Biden does have a long-standing record of being really quite pro-Indian. For example, the nuclear agreement, which George W. Bush gets the lion's share of the credit for, and rightly so, Joe Biden was very instrumental in steering that through the US Senate. And just using that as an example, I'm sure those of you in India can come up with more examples of where Biden has over the years been a good friend to India. And I think we can reasonably assume that that will continue to be the case, because from Washington's perspective today, not only is India the world's largest democracy and therefore seen by many, rightly or wrongly, I think there are some question marks over this, as a natural ally of the United States. It is also the case that, of course, American foreign policy, whomever is in the White House come the 21st of January next year, will be very, very focused indeed on China. And if we go all the way back to the days of the Bush administration, when Robert Blackwell was the US ambassador in New Delhi, you'll recall that even at that time, Ambassador Blackwell was talking about India as a counterweight in Asia to China's emerging at that time and now fully matured, to all intents and purposes, rise. Now, interestingly enough, Robert Blackwell published another eminent paper earlier this year in May, published by the CFR, which he co-authored with Thomas Wright. And I want to read you a short quote from the summary, concluding summary of that paper, if I may. Well worth getting hold of and reading in full, for all the fact that I'm only going to take a short extract. And I quote goes as follows: Washington and New Delhi should remember that their chief objective is not consensus on trade or Iran, but contending with a rising China. The United States should take care regarding its demands on Indian foreign policy when vital US national interests are not at stake, when those demands undermine balancing China, and when they relate to peripheral differences in the bilateral relationship. Now, Ambassador Blackwell has long been very influential in Republican foreign policy. Sometime around the middle of Barack Obama's second term, he co-authored a paper with Ashley Tellis called A New Strategy on China, which was very well received by Republicans, but largely ignored by Democrats at the time. I think we can reasonably assume today, however, that Robert Blackwell's thinking on China and on the role which India can play vis-a-vis China is mainstream bipartisan thinking in Washington, which alone is a good reason to read that paper, because it will undoubtedly be influential on a Biden administration. And of course, we also need in this context to consider where Joe Biden stands on China. He was long an advocate of the belief that if China grows, if China becomes economically more prosperous, it would become an internationally responsible player and maybe eventually a democracy bed in the United States. And this isn't a Trump-driven event. This is something which began even when Obama was still president. And it would be fair to say that Joe Biden has made a long journey on China to be where he is today, which is pretty squarely in the hawkish camp of China as a strategic rival to the US and to be dealt with as a strategic rival. Now, there are some caveats to that, of course, because unlike Donald Trump, as you remarked in your opening remarks, Annelies, Biden does want to develop US policy on climate change, to return to the Paris Accord, which incidentally the US doesn't formally leave until the 6th of November. I think he will go straight back into it once he gets into the White House, assuming he wins the election. He'd also want to work with China on some regional issues, notably the JCPOA and the Iran nuclear program. So there is going to have to be a greater measure of... I am getting an interruption. Thank you. Thank you. There will have to be cooperation with China under the Biden foreign policy model as well. So it's going to be a bit pick and mix. I think we will see cooperation on China, climate change. We will see cooperation on issues like Iran. On the other hand, I can't see Joe Biden lifting the existing tariffs on goods from China. That would be very unpopular with many in his party. There's a lot of protectionists in the Democratic Party, and I think those tariffs are going to stay in place, at least as leverage to bring China to the table on other issues. However, the biggest single issue, I think, between Biden administration and China is going to be what is actually the biggest single issue between the Trump administration and China today, and indeed a very big issue between India and China, and that is, of course, the technology war. The US, across the board, both major parties regard China's drive for parity, if not betterment of the US on the technology front, as being an existential threat to where Washington sees America's place in the world. And they will continue to push back very hard on technology, irrespective of who is in the White House next year. So expect the technology war to broaden, deepen, and continue. The big difference will be that in contrast to Trump's America alone approach, the US will look to work with other countries, close allies, third countries around the world to contain China's technological rise and to stop the spread of Chinese technological dominance. And clearly, India, which notably has decided not to join China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has begun to ban some Chinese technology apps. India is going to be a key ally to the US on this front. And instead of the Trump approach of do as we say or else. It's going to be sitting down, discussing a mutually agreed approach to dealing with this. The other big change which we'll see from the Biden administration, negotiation with allies rather than threatening allies. Having said that, there is one other big issue out there which we can't ignore between the US and China. Now, I'm going to say this very, very clearly indeed, because I think it is particularly important to India. As far as the US is concerned, we can talk about the South China Sea. We can talk about this and that, but the biggest single security issue today between the US and China is the future of Taiwan, which Xi Jinping has committed to bring back into mainland China, into the Chinese collective entity during his time as president. And I don't think by that he's going to be hanging around until the 2030s, if he can possibly avoid it. Now, the reason I want to say this clearly is the Americans are not unaware, of course, of the India-China border dispute. And that's the seriousness and importance of that is, I have to say, very largely underestimated by the wider world outside those of us who follow India closely or are actually in India. This is a very serious issue indeed, which could blow up at any time into something even more serious than it is today. But as far as the US is concerned today, the main focus of attention is going to be on Taiwan. And I think it would pay the Indian government extremely well to get the American government, the Biden administration, more aware, more interested, and more seized of the problems around the line of actual control between India and China today. So a bit of a mission for the Indian government there with a Biden administration coming in. Moving on, I've already briefly mentioned climate change. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of it to the Biden administration. It does look like it would be, for a Biden administration, the main signature issue of the first 4 years of a Biden presidency. He has played it extremely well. He's united his own party on the issue. As I said earlier, I think he'll come back on day one into the Paris Accord. I do think he will struggle in some respects. He will not, for example, be able to bring in a domestic carbon tax. I think that's too difficult, but he could, and again, this is an issue of importance to India, he could bring in a border carbon tax against imports from countries which have perceived lower environmental standards than the US itself. He's going to have to pursue climate change at home largely through regulation. That will take time, but he will look to move the US forward quickly on the international stage. And for the first time for 4 years, it looks like politically at least, we will have the world's 4 largest economies, China, Japan, the European Union, and the US, politically aligned on climate change, which means that the agenda is likely to move forward more quickly than would otherwise be the case. And clearly India has a very, very vital role to play in that. Now, having said that, it's also worth keeping in mind that for Joe Biden, global warming is about jobs. He has a quote from back in January, February, when I hear global warming, I think jobs. Biden wants to bring manufacturing jobs back to America. Deglobalization, in other words. Now, this is likely to continue. I don't think anything's going to deter him from that. There are risks for the developing world, of course, in that respect, manufacturing sector in particular. So India perhaps stands not to be hit as hard as some countries which are more dependent on manufacturing. And in one respect, actually, India stands to benefit enormously from this. One of the thorns in US-India relations under President Trump has been visa policy in America. And there is already a very clear series of statements by Joe Biden that in the best interest of economic recovery post-COVID-19 in the US, which will of course be absolutely his top priority, he will be looking to revert to a visa regime which favors bringing in high-skilled individuals to help development of US technology sector in particular, part of the technology war. I can see it happening more broadly than just in the technology sector. And that, of course, stands to be of enormous benefit to individual Indians and indeed to Indian companies, Indian IT sector. And when those individuals who've perhaps trained in the US, worked in the US, come back to India, that stands to be a big positive for the Indian economy. Now, all of that sounds very good. And I think those are the main headlines. There's a lot of other issues we could talk about in detail, naval cooperation with the US, Japan, Australia, lots of stuff out there, which we may get to in due course. But I want to keep this reasonably brief. Downsides. You already mentioned it, Annelies. And I think in talking about this, I'm actually going to go to Kamala Harris. As is very well known in India, Kamala Harris is half Indian, has an Indian mother, and is very proud of that fact. And when she was announced to be nominated as vice presidential candidate, I did see a lot of outpouring of joy in India, but I also saw quite a lot of negative comments as well, in particular because of Ms. Harris's frequent comments on human rights in India, and in particular on Kashmir. And I do think if there is one big issue which could cause irritation between the Modi administration in particular and the Biden administration, it's going to be that, especially given the very strong progressive wing in his party, Joe Biden is going to feel obliged to speak out on human rights, on Kashmir, and so on and so forth, Robert Blackwell's advice notwithstanding. And that could bedevil other aspects of the US-India relationship if it were to spin out of hand. Now, I think that Joe Biden, who does have a habit of saying things which perhaps he shouldn't say from time to time, I think he will try to be measured and careful on this, but he is going to have to speak out, and he is going to have to speak out publicly. And I'm going to leave it to the Indians on the discussion today to talk about the impact which that may have on US-India relations in detail. Finally, I want to say this. Actually, because Donald Trump has not spoken out on human rights, because he has broadly not spoken out on human rights anywhere, with perhaps the notable exception of Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba, for reasons which have everything to do with lots of other issues. The Modi-Trump relationship has not been a bad relationship, even though Donald Trump, in all the time he has been president to date, has actually only visited India once, as far as I can recall. But overall, things haven't been so bad between India and the US. And there are clear signs that if we do get a second Trump term, especially if perhaps Michael Pompeo, who is a seasoned diplomat, for all the fact that there are many aspects of his policies with which one could disagree, if Michael Pompeo is still Secretary of State, I think there would be a determined effort by a Trump 2.0 administration to continue to build a strong relationship with India going forward, especially with an eye to dealing with China. So we shouldn't assume necessarily that things are going to be better under a Biden administration than they would be under a second Trump term. But I want to go back to something I said right at the beginning. Whilst one could say better the devil you know, in this case Donald Trump, it would also be true to say that from the perspective of foreign policy experts, from the perspective of governments generally, predictability and consistency are extremely valuable commodities, especially in bilateral relationships. So what I am going to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, is I think that if Donald Trump is re-elected, India-US relations will remain strong. But I think if Joe Biden wins the election, India-US relations overall, albeit with a few bumps in the road, will be stronger too. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Newton. It was wonderful insight into the mind of Joe Biden. Must be you have captured most of the things which might be going through his mind. There are psephologists in the US who are saying that in the last 40 years, only Jim Carter and George Bush Sr., they have only lost their re-election And since then, every president got a re-election done. So will this be another history or not? We will get to know in maybe in a month's time. Uh, Now, may I request the principal discussant of today's lecture, Professor Chwalia. Professor Chwalia, you have also written about that Modi and Joe Biden, if he gets elected, they can work together. But there are issues, very sensitive to Indian community, both in India as well as in the US, that is related to Kashmir. And Kamala Harris means no words in siding with our opponents. And secondly, there is a contentious issue of, the Citizens Amendments Act, which India brought in, welcoming, the religiously persuaded, minorities in our neighborhood. We have opened our doors to them and given them citizenship. Many Democrats have, spoken against this as well. So I wanted to understand from you, since you have closely watched India as well as US. So how do you see, and secondly, do the analysis of Mr. Newton's lecture today. Help us in understanding and give us the perspective that how should Indian community view these elections. Mr. Chwalia, mic is yours.
Thank you, Anilesh. Greetings, everyone. Namaste. Very good to be in this panel and with distinguished people. We are indeed on the cusp of something big. As a retired diplomat, Mr. Newton balanced it and said that it's not over yet and any result is possible. So, but of course, strategic thinking requires that countries around the world plan for any eventuality, including, of course, the Biden presidency. It's definitely a possibility. Um, as per the betting market, it's a distinct possibility. So we must indeed think about what this means for us in India and for the world. So I just want to pick a couple of macro points relating to a possible Biden presidency. Um, I think Mr. Newton is spot on when he says that Biden's basically is a liberal internationalist and he wants to turn the clock back to where it was in 2016. And many of his advisors and the traditional democratic intelligentsia and establishment elites who support him, both in the media and in government and the bureaucracy, think tanks, almost all of them believe that the US must play a bigger, expanded role in the world again. So this is a macro level ideological given when it comes to a democratic presidency, especially somebody like Biden. As Mr. Newton pointed out, he has spent many years doing foreign policy. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was a chair, and then even as vice president, he was engaging at the highest levels with China, with India, with the Europeans under Obama. So there's no question that Biden, will want to return. But the question, and very well put by Mr. Newton, the issue is there a contradiction there? Because it seems like a lot of water has flown down the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., and in American society in the last few years as a result of the economic crisis that started in 2008 and now compounded by the coronavirus and the current depression that they are staring at. So in that sense, Biden sounds atavistic, like Obama 2.0 kind of thing. But the problem is that the society is in a churn, and it's almost like you see a manifestation of deep crisis in American society, the polarization and all that. So even if he wins, um, I doubt that if he can carry along the society to play this old interventionist and engaged and highly globalist type of foreign policy. I wrote a book just last year called Trump, Emerging Powers in a Post-American World. And at that time, this is in the pre-pandemic period when it looked like Trump was going to be a shoo-in and that he would win a second term. And at the time, I was arguing that even if Trump loses and doesn't get reelected, some of the currents that he has been channeling, especially isolationism and withdrawal from very many things around the world, diplomatic withdrawal, military withdrawal, um, less disinterestedness about global balances of power in different regions, and simply an unwillingness to carry the burden of this Pax Americana. Now, if the society, and it's interesting that, of course, people are not voting on foreign policy, right? I mean, primarily they're voting on the economy, on healthcare, on the pandemic, on race and other issues. I mean, it's always been the case that even during world wars, US elections were determined mainly by domestic considerations. So, of course, the public is likely, it looks like, may kick Trump out of the door, but that's not because they disagree with his worldview, and that's not because they disagree with his foreign policy outlook, which is isolationist and transactionalist. That's because he has messed up a lot of things domestically, and he's been very divisive domestically. So my fear for a potential Biden administration is that the central contradiction is going to be, he will want to revive this Pax Americana and to be heavily involved in shaping different outcomes around the world, especially with the balance of power. Because traditionally, the liberal internationalists for decades in the US system have wanted to maintain balance of power in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia, or what we now call Indo-Pacific. So these were the three critical areas on which US foreign policy was focused on. And the grand strategy. Now, if Biden wants to bring that back, I don't think he has the social support either among his own, the far left, the Ilhan Omars and the Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez type of far left democratic politicians, the base as they call it, or in the general society. So he will have to adjust and actually tone down some of this, the liberal internationalism that's carried him forward. And what that means also is that on the question of values, coming to Anilesh's point, yes, Biden and some of the advocates for the so-called liberal values around the world, democracy and human rights, might train their guns on India for various things that we are doing to secure our country and to actually enhance security in the region. And they might view it from a different lens. There is a liberal intelligentsia that's been attacking India left, right, and center in the last 6 years, distorting the picture of what is happening in the country and presenting a highly unfounded scenario of minorities being repressed or suffering in India, which is all, of course, not at all borne out by the empirical evidence. But whatever it is, there is that whiff that Biden will perhaps be forced to carry, as Mr. Newton said. But on the other hand, the Biden is a politician at the end of the day, and if he wins, he knows, he can sense that the pulse of the public is not to actually lecture the rest of the world on human rights or democracy. And if it does, it is going to be strategic, I think, and more focused on China for strategic reasons. I mean, frankly speaking, even democratic leaders have embraced extreme totalitarian regimes like Saudi Arabia in the past. So this values thing, it's always selective in US foreign policy. Human rights promotion has always been, used as a strategic instrument to apply pressure on countries that oppose US interests, not necessarily on countries that go along with US interests. So I feel that maybe we don't have to worry too much about this human rights lobby and so on, because the domestic circumstances in the US are such, Biden has to pull the country out of depression, economic depression. Lecturing India on multiculturalism and liberal values is not going to get them out of economic depression. So he's actually, and it's quite clear, he's going to be a transitional president. I mean, you look at his age. Trump was the oldest American to ever get elected. He was 70 when he won in when he took office in 2017 January, and I think Reagan was the earlier oldest, is 69. If Biden wins and takes office in January 2021, he's going to be 78. I believe he has a birthday coming up in November. 78 years old, he's going to be a transitional figure. There's no question of a person like him, no matter how fit he is, getting a second term. So what we're talking about is only 4 years. And then maybe Kamala Harris or somebody younger from within the Democratic Party rising up the ranks to fill in the shoes. So what I'm trying to say is that Biden will not have enough time really to do this big global reinsertion of the US, be it in our region or around the world, be it on human rights or values. It's actually going to be a disappointing presidency from a foreign policy point of view because of these contradictions that I'm talking about. He will not really have a long forward-looking vision. I can't think of a 70, 80-year-old president having something like that when he knows that by the time he hangs up, he's going to be 82 or older. With no, with due respect to the elderly, the point is you need some fresh vigor and new to look at Asia, especially our region, with a new pair of eyes. And Biden is actually bringing the old pair of eyes back. So I'm making a complex argument, but at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is maybe we should not hype the impact of a Biden presidency at all because of these inherent contradictions and limitations. Let me just add one more issue about the Biden method. And I think Mr. Newton is absolutely right about that. He will embrace allies. He will negotiate with allies, not threaten allies and partners the way Trump did. So yes, that is going to be a difference. Definitely, I think that US diplomatic corps had been completely demoralized in the last 4 years because of the Trump strategy of distancing himself from allies and partners and treating everybody like a competitor. So to that extent, I think there's going to be a bit of a revival of the diplomatic strength of the US, which had been depleted in the last 4 years. They will try to bring back, career mainstream liberal internationalist type people. But again, the question is, will the society in America be willing to go along? Because when I was researching my last book, Trump, what I realized is the powerful pull of domestic politics has increased so much that it's likely to determine more and more of the foreign policy, especially of major powers like the US. So there is a drag down effect or a pull down effect, I expect, coming from within the US, and an unwillingness to spend and to be charitable and to be strategically altruistic and all those things which the liberals generally project around the world for the US. So I think Biden will do well if he adjusts to a multipolar world, the one that Mr. Newton mentioned, and they do more of what we call the offshore balancing, where they prop up countries which are democratic or on which they have trust, like India, and give us the best possible military equipment, give us technology transfer, give us concessions on trade, give us a level playing field for our exporters to gain access to their markets, and essentially that that's to concede that the US on its own or even in partnership with 2 or 3 cannot really counterbalance China. So yes, Biden will come in with all the talk about democracy versus authoritarianism. We have to stop this authoritarian China and all that. But for it to translate, they will need to pick some horses and really invest in them and be very generous to them. And that's the problem, because the more generous the US tries to be, the more the dissent within the US society about trade and about giving concessions to rising powers and developing countries. So that populist sentiment vis-a-vis other countries and the mistrust of other countries and the whole belief that America is being shortchanged or is being exploited by its partners, that sentiment is not gone away even if Biden wins. So there is going to be that elitism of Biden and his immediate coterie, and then there's going to be the rest of the U.S. society which is tired of playing this big global role. So he'll have to contend with that. So I'll stop there, but simply say that from our point of view, maybe we have been talking about multi-alignment and such things in India, because even in spite of the severe crisis we are having with China, it's quite clear that relying only on the United States, even if there is a Biden presidency, is not going to help us solve our strategic dilemmas. And the reason for it is quite obvious. Mr. Newton was talking about the American focus on the Pacific side, which is basically the East Asia, Taiwan Straits, maybe South China Sea, East China Sea, rather than on the Himalayas and inland. So U.S. Pacific Command, Indo-Pacific Command, is there, and they are unlikely to think in terms of more territorial as they get into the landmass of Asia. If you look at the map of South and Central Asia, so which is where, of course, the contention right now is happening. But the maritime dimension is there. We will need to extract more from the US, better terms for our military cooperation, interoperability, technology transfer. I'm sorry to say that despite the presence of a Defense Technology Trade Initiative, DTTI, with the US for many years, there haven't been many signature initiatives of bilateral cooperation where the US actually manufactured weapons in India or transfer technology to India. So these are the things where I think they still look at us as buyers of sophisticated weaponry rather than as co-producers. So I think these are some of the areas where I think they will need to think bigger and somehow manage the domestic xenophobia. Frankly, I mean, we have 40 to 50% of the population. Even if Trump loses, he's going to get at least 45% of the popular vote share, probably, or more than 40. So we're talking about significant, and then there are many even Biden voters who don't believe in doing this big global good and all that, and who are inwardly focused right now. So I think Mr. Newton had an interesting point that India's strategy should be to try and draw Biden presidency's attention to LAC and to the conflict with China, and to leverage the US card more, and to be able to bring in more American technology and know-how. Already Trump administration this year, 2020, they have moved in the direction. We're talking about Sky Guardian drones and such things that we are purchasing from the US now to better monitor the PLA movements on the Chinese side of the LAC. Biden has said things like, we will stand with India on its border and all along the region where it faces challenges. He's referring to Himalayas and to Indo-Pacific. I think it's a tall order. I don't expect that much from the US. I believe that we are in a post-American world, but nonetheless, the US is a great power. It's not the sole superpower or the indispensable power anymore, but it remains one of the two great powers. And when we have a clear clarity in our own mind that the other great power poses the largest existential threat to our security, we have to align with the other side, but not alone, as I said, but with many others in the region. Our multi-alignment strategy should work with the US as one of the important pillars. But how much we can extract from Biden, I'm skeptical given these background conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chwalia. It was really wonderful insight, as well as you have articulated it very beautifully. We have spoken about the bilaterals, but the other thing which may come as a positive for Mr. Joe Biden would be his predictability, especially towards the multilaterals. We have seen Mr. Donald Trump in last 4 years. He demolished most of the multilaterals. This could be because China has overtaken most of them. WTO, he has already challenged. World Health Organization, he has already challenged. Climate change, he has already challenged. And there are various multilaterals, whom he demolished in his 4 years term. Mr. Newton, Mr. Chwalia has made his, statement. If you have something to respond, you have a right to reply. You can utilize that, sir.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there's really much I want to add at this stage. I think the point which the good professor made, which is most important in my mind, is that the Americans cannot dictate the bilateral relationship. Now, one of the problems I had with the George W. Bush era was that there was this idea in Washington that America could more or less get India to do its bidding. I'm hopeful that Biden would not come to the presidency with that attitude. And I do think that there is a very good opportunity here, with India seen as a key partner, for the Indian government to engage with the US government, with a Biden administration, to come up with a relationship which is mutually advantageous. And I think the professor put that across extremely clearly indeed. So I would echo that entirely at this stage, and keep in mind that although I was talking about the views, perceptions, and priorities which Joe Biden would bring to the table, in order to consider where the bilateral relationship will go over time, we also need to consider that India has, I hope, an equal voice in determining the bilateral relationship. And I would say this to reinforce that, and that is, it's very important to remember that Joe Biden does believe, I think, that he owes a considerable debt to Barack Obama, because Obama took Biden, who was a rival in the primary stage in 2008, on as his vice president, gave him a proper voice in the room. Obama said the vice president will always be in the room, and he stuck to that. And I think Biden does regard it as being part of his role as president, be it for 4 years or 8, and I rather tend to agree that it's more likely to be 4. It does regard it as his role to continue in very much the same frame as Barack Obama. And if we go back to the immediate aftermath of the first ever G20 summit on the 15th of March 2009, at the press conference immediately after that, the most important thing which Barack Obama said is that America will continue to be if not the major player on the global stage, but we will be very much in listening mode when it comes to our dealings with our allies in particular. And this is a big opportunity for India to become an even bigger player on the global stage than would otherwise be the case, and certainly an easier opportunity than there would be if Donald Trump is still in the White House next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Newton. We have time for open house. If somebody wants to ask question, just raise your hand. There's an e-hand option here, so you can raise the e-hand. Jyoti, you wanted to ask question? Dr. Jyoti Kiran Shukla?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Newton. First of all, it was a very insightful, very thought-provoking, and it was not just from the lateral point of view, it gave us a different perspective in terms of India optimizing its strategic understandings too. But my question is relating to you. In one of your interviews just said that you expect very volatile economic and market situations post-elections in US. In relation to that, India has undergone some structural changes in the economy in terms of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliant India, as we call it or term it. What do you think is going to be the exact implication in terms of, you've touched the IT sector and you've touched the manufacturing sector, but I just needed a little more specific response in terms of interactions of two economies in terms of the new policy metrics. Thank you.
Let me start by saying this is a really difficult question to answer, and I'm going to go big picture initially. I don't think anybody who works in financial markets, which is where I still make most of my living, is in any doubt at all that we are living in a big bubble, particularly in equity markets, which are, of course, especially important to India. And that bubble could burst at any time. Now, this is not my base case. I am not going to sit here and tell you that the bubble is definitely going to burst after the US election. But we all know that bubbles burst sooner or later, and the proximate cause of that is not always readily apparent until ex post. So we are living on the brink of a possible bursting of the bubble, which clearly would have a severe impact on India, on the assumption that the American bubble bursting spreads into global contagion, because India's economy is very much about your, if I may say so, extremely well run and well regulated equity market. And foreign investors, of course, would, under those sorts of circumstances, become deeply risk averse, and you would see foreign capital in particular fleeing out of emerging markets generally, be it India or any other emerging market. So that would also be damaging. Now, coming down to from that 30,000-foot view of the world to the specific of your question, which is technology. Again, there is a difficult issue here, and this is, where would a Biden administration go in its dealings with big tech? There is a lot of concern around the world today, as you know, about the dominance of the big technology companies. And this is not something to which we have a clear answer. I think there are good reasons for that. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a priority for the Biden administration. Kamala Harris has had, during her time working for the state of California, quite a close relationship with big technology companies there. These companies are big donors, and you can't talk about American politics without thinking about the influence of the corporate sector, which promises to be a particularly difficult issue for a Biden-Harris administration, given the somewhat jaundiced view of a lot of the progressives in the Democratic Party over the influence of big business in the US, a view which I must say I do have some sympathy with personally, given the extent to which money talks in US politics today. Now, clearly, if a Biden administration, or indeed a Democratic-controlled Congress during a Biden administration, were to decide to get after big tech, this could seriously rattle the whole of the IT sector worldwide, which is closely interlinked, despite the efforts of the US over the course of the last year in particular, to break the relationship between China and the rest of the world, but the US in particular, in the technology sector. I do think, though, that there is a potential opportunity for India, and the opportunity is as a substitute for China in manufacturing technological solutions to relevant issues. You have the skill sets, you have the individuals, you don't have the manufacturing base to any great extent, but I do think that there could be an opportunity for India in all of this. But I think it's going to be a very bumpy and probably rather unpredictable trajectory going forward. But if I were India, I would certainly be looking increasingly to ramp up the country's technological capabilities in order to try to take advantage, which a bifurcated world in technology will undoubtedly create for manufacturing and technological innovation outside of China itself.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive reply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Newton. I think there are no more questions coming in. If somebody has it, so just I'm asking for the last time. Okay, then let's move ahead. Now may I request Dr. Nayan to give his concluding remarks, and then we can wind it up, sir.
No, but there is a question in the box. So Mr. David Miss has asked, I think.
No, that's an observation here.
Observation.
David Miss, you wanted to ask any question?
Well, Anilesh, David is a friend from America. I'd invited him.
Okay, it's okay, no problem. Rajiv, mic is yours. You can make your concluding.
No, thank you very much. And we all agree it was a very enlightened and informed discussions. Several questions were raised, and as Professor Chaulia very rightly pointed out, as no hype. We should discuss if Biden comes to power, what objectively may happen and what could be its implications for India. And I think if we keep that in mind, and if that is the thread running throughout the discussion, I think it was very useful. No doubt, if Biden comes to power, he cannot ignore what all Trump has done. There are certain issues which he will have to pay attention to. But first, I will start with, because I have been given some time, so I should exploit the opportunity given to me, about the very opinion poll results. If you recollect 2016, the world was very optimistic that somehow Madam Clinton would scrape through. But it did not happen. Why did not happen? Because what we generally know, that the global knowledge order or the global information order is too liberal. And at times it ignores the grassroots reality. And it ignored the grassroots reality even in 2016. And suddenly there was a shock in the form of Donald Trump. And he kept shocking. I must say that he kept shocking, but at times he surprised the world. He did not shock. He behaved very rationally, especially on North Korea, on business issues. And we should not forget that he took America to a recovery path, and it had the recovery growth rate of around 3%, 3.1, between 2.9 to 3.1%. And the section which is going to be affected by this economic recovery may keep quiet, but may vote differently. But if you see all the opinion polls, which I was just trying to recheck after third round of the debate, whether there is any sea change or any dramatic change, I realized that it's still almost 10% difference is persisting. There is not much change. So 10% is a big number. And plus in some of the swing states like Georgia, where last time Trump had taken the lead, he is not just lagging behind, but he is conceding quite, I will not say hugely, but he is conceding. So these are the questions, but we have to keep our fingers crossed. We should not predict the victory of Biden's victory in advance, much in advance. We should keep waiting. So this is my observation on very coming of Biden's to power. On other issues, on Pakistan, generally in India, once we are talking about implications for India, Trump has been forthcoming, and I checked all the statements made by Biden. He looked slightly quiet on Pakistan. Yes, he was very vociferous on Al-Qaeda, on terrorism, but not so much on how he is going to deal with Pakistan. Is he still going to be hyphenating the relationship, or he will be de-hyphenating? On Afghanistan, I think both are going to pursue a new strategy, and they have to figure in. So even if Biden comes to power, that India, he cannot ignore India. When he was vice president, and he gave a special importance to India, and he told that India should not feel that it will be ignored when United States works out any plan for Afghanistan, whether it is withdrawal, when it is going to withdraw, when Biden administration is going to withdraw from its troops from Afghanistan, we should be clear. But more important thing, when I'm talking about Afghanistan, then we should talk about, and we have talked about Kamala Harris and apprehensions which Kamala Harris has generated in our part of the world. And because her uncle was my colleague, he just retired from my institute, and I had to give his telephone number to several journalists to talk about that. So I think I am of the view that we should not be scared. This is what I'm saying. In Afghanistan, when Biden was asked about persecuted Hindus and Sikhs, he was very categorical. that they have got the right to have an exile and they can go to India, and he was supporting what we supported in Citizenship Amendment Act. So that part we should not be very apprehensive. I think Kamala Harris was misled by what Professor Sriram Cholia very rightly pointed out, the liberal onslaught, and as he very rightly pointed out, without empirical evidence. And if we confronted this, so I mean our own liberals, forget about the global liberals, you ask him what is your problem with Citizenship Amendment Act, and you will find all wrong answers coming.
Absolutely.
And basically that act, what I'm here would like to have our, in fact, we'll request persons like Alistair to remove these apprehensions, these misgivings existing in the Western world. This is about persecuted minorities in certain countries. It has nothing to do with Indian minorities, but somehow the propaganda was unleashed that it had to do something with our own minorities. I think she was swayed away by that kind of propaganda war. So I think we'll have to work hard, and we'll have to tell even Biden administration, if it comes to power. I am always using caveat and for Biden, until unless the result comes, I am not going to believe it. So this is on, and even human rights. We have got so many institutions and initiatives to promote human rights in our country. So I don't think we should be worried about human rights. We can debate about human rights with these countries, with the countries which are raging, with the forces, with the elements which are raging about it. You can have a perception. We can also have a perception about human rights, but we are not. We are a democratic country. How come we will go against human rights of any section of our society? So I think that we'll have to feel confident. We should not go defensive. We should come out. This is what on this I would like to say, because I should not exploit much of my time, but the opportunity given. So I will just raise two more issues. One on China, and second on economic relationship between the two. On China, yes, generally Democrats are considered to be slightly harsh on China because in recent years, Republicans meant business. They were influenced more by the business section, you can say their trade interests. And China, of course, was providing opportunities. We have limited time, otherwise I could have went on and on about how it was United States which accommodated China in the global order in 1960s by splitting the Soviet socialist bloc, and all kinds of concessions it made. And one of the concessions was the famous Green Line. Famous Green Line in 1978, when high technology commerce was facilitated by relaxing, by changing in the American regulations and law. And this is how China pursued its four modernization policy and four modernization drive. And weeks later, when it started becoming a kind of monster, you can say bhasmasur, which we will say in our language, in high technology and emerging technology. Again, emerging technology is slightly debatable, contested concept. Yet the components of the high technology sector, China is like artificial intelligence in many sensors, how China is investing, but whether it has bridged the gap is a big question mark. So China will be, even if Biden comes to power, I think again I will go that we should not go by the hype. Even during the trade war during the trade war between China and United States, we saw a number of projects, green projects, and even data industry getting investment from United States. Some around $50 billion business was shifted to some supply chain companies is located in different places. but all the beneficiaries were Europe, Australia, and South Korea. India did not take much benefit even out of that. So now our challenge should be whatever business is getting shifted out of that place, whether by Trump or by Biden, how we can somehow exploit it. If we are not able to do it, if we don't build our infrastructure, the very hype is not going to help us. Even if Biden gets many of the industry, many of the companies shifted, whether we are going to get benefit out of it is slightly debatable and questionable. That we have to do our preparation, we have to invest in our infrastructure, only then we can get benefit. Otherwise, European companies, even Vietnam reaped benefit out of this shifting. So this is on China. On military issues, I think Biden will be more conscious because he is also arguing for troop withdrawal. Second issue which he is regularly, although saying that we will not do defense cuts, but he may have to do defense cut. Many other security issues. Biden is slightly not as hawkish as Trump is. It is well known. So that part, I think, we'll have to be slightly careful when we are making any observation. So this is on business we have just discussed. So this is what I have to say. So I can speak more, but I think Anilesh, I need to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajeev Nayan. Thank you very much. Thanks for concluding this wonderful discussion. Now may I request Professor Dwarika Unial. Dr. Unial is Dean at Flame University, Pune, and in honorary capacity, he's heading the research wing at CIEU. Professor Unial, the mic is yours. You can propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Anilesh. Good evening, good morning, everyone. Extremely pleased to thank you, all of you, for such an interesting discussion today. This is this is a topic which will be keep on going until the cows come home. Or whole night we could do this. And with Mr. Newton and his erudite presentation and the discussion by my old friend Sriram, good to see you. And it's been quite some time since we met. Of course, the concluding comments by Dr. Nayan. I think this was a very, very good, interesting discussion, and we should build on this. On the other side of it, that what is the Trump administration would mean for India. We have already done one talk, and then on this, we should build on this from CIU. On behalf of the board of CIU, Anilesh, Mr. Ashwini Mahajan, and others, a pleasure to host all of you on this particular Bauddhic session. As the name suggests, that it is a intellectual discussion among like-minded people, scholars, authors, professors, CEOs, and it's a small initiative from CIU to engage with like-minded people who want to work no left, no right, but for India and India's progress, so that we can provide excellent policy input to whoever government comes in and works in this particular country. So we are India-centric people, as Anilesh likes to call it. We are, and we would like to invite all of you for other sessions as well and engage with us in intellectual discussions, joint collaborations, joint research, publications, and case studies and white papers, and create excellent intellectual and policy input for the government and others. On behalf of CIU, thank you, and have a good evening and good morning, whichever part of the world you happen to be in. Thank you, and Anilesh, back to you.
Thank you, Professor Unial. On behalf of everybody, I also thank you all. Thanks, Alistair Newton. You have taken your time out, and despite your busy schedule, you took your time out, and you helped us in understanding Mr. Biden's mind. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Chwalia. Thank you, Dr. Rajeev Nayan, Smitaji. Thank you, Paddy. Thank you, Paddy sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jyotiji.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, Baltej ji. Thank you very much.
Anilesh ji, congratulations.
Thank you, ji. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Another rocking show.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Anilesh.
Thank you, Jyoti ji. We will speak over the phone.